All right. Oh, okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Stephanie Fitch. I am the grant manager for the Montana Obstetrics and Maternal Support, or MOMS grant. We're very excited to have you joining us today for Amy Stiffarm's presentation on cultural safety and how we can better serve our perinatal families. Um, just a few reminders before we jump in. We are going to ask that people introduce themselves in the chat today. Just let us know who you are and where you're joining us from. We already have 40 people here, so live introductions could get a bit lengthy. With Moms Project Echo, we do offer CNE, so if you would like to claim that, we just ask that you attend 90% of the session live and then complete the evaluation link that we send out next day. If you would like to join the moms listserv, feel free to do so at our website, mcmoms.org. I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Amy. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to pop those into the chat and she will be answering them at the conclusion of the presentation. So thank you, Amy. We're excited to have you here and just excited that you're part of Moms. We're very lucky to have you.
Aw, thanks so much. I'm happy to be here. Love that these opportunities are available and just honored and really grateful for having this space to talk about such an important topic, and grateful that we have so many folks interested in learning about this. I see a lot of some familiar faces, and really excited to see so many participants here. So I think that's just says a lot about our state. I feel like, we do have a lot of work to do. That's true. But there are people here ready to show up and put in the work. And so I just want to really say thank you for being here and taking the time to hear what I have to present. So the title of this talk today is called Cultural Safety, Improving Perinatal Care for Indigenous Families. So I'm going to go ahead and get right into it, try to cover what I can. And then there is an additional kind of like follow-up to this one. It'll be held next month, and I'll have some information on the last slide about that. Oh, maybe I will advance my slides. Maybe I won't. There we go. And you guys can see my slides okay, right? Some of you are on camera. I see a thumbs up. Okay, awesome. Thank you. So I just recently completed the Indigenous Health PhD program at the University of North Dakota. And one of the first things that they taught us was the importance of telling people who you are, and that it's not always about the education you have or the degree you have, the initials behind your name. But when you're working with tribal people, Indigenous communities, people want to know what's in your heart. They want to know what brings you to this work. So I always start off by saying that I'm a tribal member. I'm Ani from the Fort Belknap Indian community. I grew up, went to high school in Harlem, right there. And then I left to attend a tribal college on the Flathead Indian Reservation, Salish Kootenai College. And I decided to go into public health because I wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, and I wanted to see what was out there. Well, during my degree program, I had my first daughter, and in my experience and learning about my relatives' experience, I found that there were some major inequities when it came to breastfeeding and chest feeding. For example, at that time, there was one certified lactation consultant on on the reservation of Fort Belknap. So people were having to already travel really far, an hour away, even staying on res for some moms and birthing people. And if there was an issue, they were driving 2 hours one way to get help. So that made me really interested in like, why is that? What's going on here? A lot of the papers were just saying like, well, Native Americans don't breastfeed. And that wasn't my experience. So I kept digging and digging, and finally I came across Cami Goldhammer. And I know a lot of people may have heard her speak before or know about her work. She's really a champion in maternal child health for Indigenous families. And thankfully for her, I was able to come across her work and learn about the root issues and why those inequities were there, why the rates were different for Indigenous families. Um, so that was what I focused my master's in public health degree on. For this degree, also in graduate school, before I went for my PhD, I had my second daughter. During that, I had struggled really bad with depression in pregnancy and postpartum, as well as anxiety postpartum. And so for my PhD, I decided to study perinatal mental health for Indigenous birthing people. Kind of the same thing, why is it like this? How come there's not very much in the literature? And part of my dissertation work was actually creating this toolkit on cultural safety, because in that I've just found so much, I guess, education disparities. There's not a lot of opportunities to learn about this. What I'm presenting today, I've had awesome people in the state, some out of state, look at the toolkit, non-Indigenous and Indigenous. And it's been great because like the non-Indigenous people would be like, wow, this would have been great, 10 years ago when I started at Indian Health Service. I wish we would have learned this in school. And then some of the Indigenous folks that looked at it, not only were they really great at saying, oh yeah, mention more about this or explain this a little bit better, but they also were very much like, I would love it. I would have loved it if my provider knew this about me. I also do some national work. I'm being mentored and helping with the national movement on Indigenous birth equity, and that's the crew in the picture you see below. So I guess long story short is I am deeply committed to this work. It's personal, and to be able to do this work in the state, I'm just very, very grateful. I also want to take a second to acknowledge the land where we are. I'm presenting from Helena, which is the traditional homelands of the Salish and Umskapi Piikani peoples. It was also common hunting grounds for many tribes in the area. So I do have a slide about land acknowledgements, but
she's
just,
not great about.
Oh, thanks. So real quick, if you're in the chat, if you know it, go ahead and put in whose land you're on, or the original caretakers of the land, if you know it. It's a good thing to do. Just take a second, ground yourself, and acknowledge the land and the original caretakers of the land that we're on, or maybe our clinic's on, what have you. So just to get started, this is kind of the overview of the whole toolkit. We are going to stop at, we're not going to get quite through this, but we are going to go through, what is cultural safety, talk a little bit about terminology, and then some of the historical context, but also some of the cultural context that is really important when we're working with Indigenous families. So we'll give everybody an opportunity to learn some of this. So originally I learned about cultural safety from Dr. Nicole Redvers in Principles of Indigenous Health, and we were assigned a literature review on cultural safety. And here are just a couple bullet points about it. It really takes us into action, making sure of the power dynamics in the room and engaging in a respectful way. So it's really, really about putting the power back to the patient and letting the patient decide, yes, I felt safe. I felt safe as an Indigenous person in this clinical reaction. I felt safe to utilize parts of my culture. Like I didn't have to leave who I was at the door to interact with this provider. And so we really want people to kind of take it a little bit, few steps further than cultural competency. And cultural competency is what I think has been a common training. And I think there is parts of cultural safety that are cultural competency, but it's not the only part of it. So cultural safety is the critical consciousness of healthcare professionals and organizations to engage in ongoing self-reflection and self-awareness, hold themselves accountable for providing culturally safe care as it's defined by the patient. And this is measured through progress towards achieving health equity. So here's kind of, I guess, I made it a gradient because it's like kind of as you go, or maybe an intensity, you know, being aware that people have different cultures, being sensitive about it, being, you know, aware and kind of moving appropriately, I guess. Then there's this cultural competency, which I talked about, where we're learning about people's attitudes or maybe some of their belief systems or even some cultural practices. But that's really not enough. I would say cultural safety is very similar to cultural humility, except for we're really talking about letting that patient determine if they feel safe. So I think that's a big difference, but having that awareness of the power relationships and addressing them by through reflective practice and, like I said, allowing the patient to determine if they felt safe or not. So who is cultural safety for? This is really a trick question because the toolkit was designed for family practitioners, nurses, OBGYNs, WIC counselors, all of these folks, but really it's leadership, it's the people answering the phones, it's anybody in your organization or clinic that's serving Indigenous people, and really anybody who's interested in broadening their understanding of cultural safety so that we can better serve and address some of these health inequities for Indigenous people, especially in the perinatal period. Just to give a little bit of background about the state of the literature that's out there for Indigenous perinatal health, really there's not a whole lot out there. We're oftentimes like othered in the literature, or else not mentioned at all when it comes to maternal health issues. But for the information that is out there, there's been studies on postpartum depression. We know that that's higher than the general population. We know that of the pregnancy-related deaths, that over 90% are actually preventable, and that mental health conditions are the most common underlying cause of pregnancy-related death. But there really is limited literature and data, and especially when we're looking at having Indigenous authors and that perspective of Indigenous, just Indigenous people in general. It's a lot. We're really shifting from doing research on Indigenous people to doing research with Indigenous people. And there's been a lot of effort, and including in Montana, to be bringing Indigenous folks on to help publish, help look at the paper, help design the study, you know, from the very beginning, and engaging Indigenous communities in that way. And that is, you have to know the cultural values if you're going to complete a good study, a relevant study. So that is happening, but right now for what's published, we still need to grow that type of literature in the field. So why are we focusing on power? The social determinants of health have an important influence on health inequities. So these are the unfair and avoidable differences in health status seen within and between communities. So really at all levels of income and health and illness, they follow a social gradient. So the lower that your position, your socioeconomic status is, then the worse the health. But we learned about social determinants of Indigenous health. So Reading and Wien have outlined social determinants of Indigenous health because there are specific things that are relevant to Indigenous people's health at the distal, kind of like the big picture, these systematic root cause levels, and then the intermediate, so the community, the healthcare systems, education, and then at the proximal, meaning like the individual levels. So some of those are settler colonialism, racism. When we're thinking of community, you know, are they from a community that has a lot of access to their cultural practices. Are they in, are they, what does their healthcare system look like? Is it Indian Health Service? Or do maybe they have a 638 status where they're able to make the budget more relevant to their community? And I have a slide on that, so I'll talk about it a little more later in this. We're gonna go through the first step of cultural safety, and I just want to acknowledge that these are hard conversations. Like, they're hard to talk about. They're hard for me to talk about. And I'm probably gonna wear out my joke of me being part history teacher as a public health scholar as an Indigenous public health scholar. But it's because we're not taught this stuff. We're not taught it in school. I didn't learn this in high school. Only reason I started learning about the true history of the United States and its impact on Indigenous peoples was because I received a tribal college education. And we're lucky enough in Montana where each reservation has one. So if there's ever any opportunities, I'm definitely like an advocate for finding ways to learn from these Indigenous institutions. So my professor, Dr. Warren, likes to remind us that to get to health equity, we have to walk through truth. So being from Montana, I often think of the buffalo, like through the storm. They don't give up. They don't like look for shelter. They put their head down and they walk through the storm. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some historical stuff in a bit that is hard to talk about, hard to hear about, and it's not personal. These are systemic issues that we're trying to address. So let's get into it. This work was actually from Australia, and it was developed by Maori nurses, and then later it was adapted for cancer patients, Indigenous, so nurses who were serving Aboriginal cancer patients. So Canada, New Zealand, Australia, they've done a lot of this work related to cultural safety. In the United States, we're getting there, we're catching up. But we kind of still have a little bit, quite a ways to go. So I'm really excited that we're doing this in Montana, that this work is happening and that people are interested and ready. So these are the cultural safety steps based on that work with Aboriginal cancer patients. And I've kind of just tweaked it to make it more relevant to the perinatal period. And like I said, we're just going to go through like this first step. Cultural consciousness or awareness of the constructs of one own's culture and recognition of unique and similar qualities of other cultural groups. So the very first step is getting to know the communities you are serving. So like I said, tribal colleges are there if you're interested, but I have a lot of good places to start at for those interested in learning more. The Montana Office of Public Instruction Indian Education for All website, their curriculum, it was actually, I've was on there a lot finding out this good information, because this is the toolkit. When I designed it, I made it very specific to Montana. I wanted to have information about Montana tribes, so that I can kind of give back to the folks in the state, to Indigenous people here, and help people provide better care. So let's kind of take some time to learn about the people we're serving. So what does it mean to be Indigenous? Which reservations are closest to you? Which tribes do your clients and patients belong to? How do they wish to identify? Some of you might already know this, but some of you might not have had the chance during all of the things that you all do to really get a chance to stop and think about this. So I'm excited to go through this all with you. And I'm just going to start with some terminology. Indigenous was defined by the Cabo study in 1982. And really that's kind of the more formal declarations or definition. It was the study by the United Nations, and so that definition is relevant too. But really, it's just a term used to describe people who are inhabitants of the land. So this is the case for the United States, the people who are indigenous to this land. You might hear, and indigenous is like kind of growing in popularity. American Indian is common, and that's especially a really common and legal and in the health realm because of federal Indian law. So some disagree with the term American Indian because Christopher Columbus thought he landed in India. So it's like, it's wrong, it's not correct. And also the fact that it's associated with America because we were here, Indigenous people were here before this land was America. Native American is also commonly used. And then this is also about having it referenced to America because it was named after an Italian explorer who was said to be the first to discover the New World. And Indigenous people, we don't really celebrate explorers because it actually brings up the fact that exploration into our homelands had a lot of bad things happen. Settler colonialism, death, and diseases, all of this. So, celebrating explorers is like, would be celebrating like our attempt to eliminate us. So we don't really do that. So that's something to keep in mind. The state of Montana recognizes Indigenous Peoples Day. So that's awesome. Turtle Island, that's commonly a term used by Indigenous people, and that's just like to describe North America. They call it Turtle Island. Indian country, you might hear that, and that's just a term to talk about like where Indigenous people are, whether that's rural or urban. And so these American Indian, Native American, they're all like generally acceptable. But mostly people do want to be called by their specific tribal name, and not just like and that can vary. So for an example, for me, when I like to talk about this, I say we, on my tribal ID, it says Grovant, but when I introduce myself, I say Aani. And the reason for that is we were named Grovant by French fur traders. And what happened was when they came and they met with our people, we did our sign to like say who we were. And it was kind of like this motion of your hands in front of you. It was to talk about like water and like a waterfall and the white clay below, because that's white clay people. That's what Aani means. But the French fur traders, for speaking two different languages, I guess, there's bound to be misunderstanding, but they misinterpreted that sign language, and gros ventre in French actually means big belly. So people can get quite offended if you call them gros ventre. And it's a misunderstanding. That's why, so like Fort Belknap College, they're now Aani Nakota College because they're reclaiming using Indigenous language and their own words for themselves. So my advice would be just be curious and ask what they prefer. Some people are multiple tribes, and so it can really depend. Everybody is going to be different. But if you have a contract or you're working with the tribe, use the language that they use. That's the best place to start, and just ask. And it's always good to have people double check spelling and whatnot, just so there's not any any misunderstandings or things that can look like disrespect. Gender inclusive language is important. So this is a photo from the Indigenous Milk Medicine Week that happened this year by an artist named Jackie Fawn. So basically, I like to use gender inclusive language, especially for the perinatal period, by saying things like birthing people or birth giver. This is to acknowledge that before colonization, multiple genders existed on this land. There's proof in Indigenous languages about more words for gender than just boy versus girl. So that's part of an Indigenous worldview, is that gender is more fluid than that, and it's based on somebody's spirit or their gift. So when you hear the term two spirit, that was a kind of like an umbrella term that was that is used to for Indigenous people to identify themselves as someone with both masculine and feminine spirits as part of their gift. So and Indigenous language in themselves are very descriptive anyway. So when we're talking about, when we say birthing person, we're recognizing the person's sacred ability to give birth and to bring new life into this world. So that's how that's learning about the people we're serving and how they identify. And we really need to recognize that there's that not everybody is the same. I'm not gonna go over all of this. This is just to say that there are like millions of Indigenous people globally, and that in the United States there's 7.2 million people who identify as American Indian or Alaska Native, and that Indigenous people account for nearly 3% of the population in the US. So 574 federally recognized tribes, and even just in Montana, even though we have 7 reservations, a lot of our reservations have more than one tribal nation on there. And then within those communities, each family is going to be different. Each individual is going to be different. So it's just best to never assume, and kind of just be curious and ask, how do you want me, how should I say your tribe, or how do you wish to identify? So now we're going to learn about some cultural constructs that are going to affect interactions with the healthcare system. So what do we know about the history of how the US was created? Are we aware of the different policies and tactics that were used against Indigenous peoples to form this country? And are we thinking about how they might impact interactions today? And the other great thing about these Project Echo series was last year we had Dr. Annie Belcourt and Dr. Donald Warren talk about some of these things. So I'm not gonna super focus in on a lot of the policy stuff, but that is a big part of my toolkit of cultural safety, because oftentimes when people talk about federal Indian policy, they're not really talking about what that means for someone who's pregnant today. Like what do those policies, how are they impacting the way we give birth and parent and go through prenatal care, all of that. So I'm gonna kind of include some examples on that. So let's get into the historical context. These are the different federal Indian policies. And we start with colonization in 1492, and the self-determination period is the most recent, which is right now. It started in 1975. But there are all these different policies, and that, I mean, even just talking about policy kind of doesn't make it seem as personal. But when we're talking about federal Indian policies, like someone signed off on these laws that impacted, in a lot of negative ways, impacted Indigenous peoples. So I'm gonna talk a little bit about that. These are, in my opinion and in my research, some ways, some of the distinct ways these different periods impact Indigenous peoples. And I have, I'll go over, looking at MMIW, how that relates to colonialism, and then all the way up through sterilization, mass sterilization, into the 70s and even later. So it's a long time frame of a lot of horrible policies that were instituted against us. So it's not like way, way, way back. Some of this stuff happened fairly recently to our parents or to our grandparents, maybe. So colonization, this relates to missing and murdered Indigenous women. And sometimes for me, I feel like I don't want to talk about this. It's a heavy subject, and birth, I don't want to have to talk about death when I'm talking about birth. But this is one of those hard truths that we have to walk through. And I think it's good for providers to understand, you know, violence against Indigenous women's bodies and birthing people was a necessity to establish the United States. There's actual like letters from the US military that talks about that, that they have wording in there about their tactics to do this and in efforts to exterminate this population. And now we see really extreme numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And that this epidemic started with colonial violence. And it's relevant because in Montana, most of us have to leave our communities to give birth. There's only one Indian health service that births babies. And then the other places that do birth babies are not like Indigenous organizations. So for the most part, folks have to leave their communities to go to prenatal appointments. And this is something that is always in the back of my mind. I have 2 daughters, so I don't like to see, those statistics. It's almost like an ignorance is bliss kind of scenario, but I do. Montana has the 5th highest missing and murdered girls and women in the country. So as an Indigenous person, as an Indigenous woman, we don't stop in certain towns. We don't go to certain stores or restaurants. So even something as simple as one of us having to use the bathroom when we're traveling turns into a very, very stressful situation. So I just think it's really important to be mindful of this when you have an Indigenous patient or their family in your office. So treaty making, this was an effort to end the violence and to take land from Indigenous tribes. So here's a map of Montana to kind of show you, this is what I used in the land acknowledgement, to show you like what the original territories were and how now what the reservations look like today. And really just removing people from that land, Indigenous worldviews don't see it as owning land. We see it as being in a relationship with land. Like it's our job to take care of the land and the land will take care of us. It's a reciprocal relationship. It's not about owning and extracting resources, not the slightest. So removing that from the land, that was like a deep emotional wound. But there were also traditional foods, traditional medicines, sacred sites that folks no longer had access to. So that deeply impacts health, especially when we're thinking of being pregnant and needing to have nourishing food or needing certain medicines that are relevant for pregnancy, birth, and even parenting little babies. So medicines that were used were no longer accessible. So I just want to give a little FYI on land acknowledgements because there's something that are common, which is good. Like it's good to acknowledge the land, but it's really meant to be a thought-provoking exercise for people whose ancestors are not the original inhabitants of the specific land that you're doing this at. So it's really not appropriate to ask Indigenous people to publicly acknowledge their own homelands. Like if we were on a reservation, we don't need to acknowledge our own homelands, but maybe a non-Indigenous organization or group could acknowledge their guest status on that homeland. And definitely don't reuse blanket land acknowledgements because that's offensive and it can cause harm and really ruin the relationships that we're trying to build. But be thoughtful about it. You can hire an Indigenous consultant to do this. A land acknowledgement should coincide or not to do the land acknowledgement for you, but to help you acknowledge the land. And this really should coincide with an act of reciprocity to Indigenous peoples to the land you're occupying. So I know some groups that have made a donation to like a local Indigenous-led nonprofit or group. So things like that. Offering scholarships if you're hosting a conference, or I've seen this a lot in the running world. People will host races and they'll offer, so many free spots to Indigenous runners to acknowledge that this is their land. Something that happened in Montana during the removal time period, when we think of removal, I learned about the Cherokee Trail of Tears. That's what's in most social studies books. But what I didn't learn about until fairly recently was the removal of the Salish peoples. So this photo here is a camp, and it would be right where you're looking at that mountain there that now has an M on it for the University of Montana, and where this camp is, that's where the University of Montana campus is. So starting in 1873, the Bitterroot Salish were forcibly removed from the Bitterroot Valley. And one of the last groups to leave was about 300 people from Chief Charlot's band, and this included elders and children. And they were in the fall months. They were made to travel over 51 miles in 2 days, or 2 nights and 3 days, from Stevensville to the Jocko Church on the Flathead Indian Reservation. So this stuff happened in Montana too. The reservation period, what's really relevant here. This was when they banned ceremonies. This was when the idea of blood quantum first came about, and this really impacted people being able to access traditional medicine and like healing practices. So when we're thinking of assimilation, a topic that we've been hearing a lot more about and has been getting a lot of attention finally is boarding schools. So this was shifting from that mindset of exterminating Indigenous communities to really trying to assimilate them and to Americanize them. So children as young as 3 years old were removed from families and sent to these boarding schools where they were away from their family for a majority of the year. And these were either a lot of them were ran by churches, but they were funded through the government. If you didn't want to send your children, which most people didn't, they were threatened with jail or withholding food rations. So people were forced to send their children. So by 1926, 83% of Indigenous school-age children were in boarding schools. And a lot of bad things happened here. There was a lot of violence, sexual violence. And so there's a very, very traumatic experiences happening. And during this time, it was also for many folks, it was their first experience with Western medicine, their first time seeing a non-Indigenous doctor. So that connection to that Western medical system is for a lot of families already attached to trauma. So this is what I mean when I say, like, it's not personal. These are systematic issues. So sometimes if maybe there's an elder in the room and you can tell they don't trust you, it's probably part of the reason comes from this. How boarding schools impact us today. So this is when I was talking about Cami Goldhammer. She really was the one to be like, hey, Native Americans, yes, we have low rates of breastfeeding and chest feeding, but it's because we removed children from the home and they were not able to see how their mother or their parent cared for their younger siblings. What did they do in pregnancy? What did they do during childbirth? how did they breastfeed? How did they care for their child? How did they love their child? None of this was able to be passed on to that next generation because they were removed. So that this still has impacts today. And I hear about them all the time. And it's good that this is being examined through organizations like the boarding school, what were they called? National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. They've been doing great research. I think this is kind of, they've updated it to like their research on how many actual sites there were. So in Montana, there were 18 boarding school sites. So that's quite a bit. To give you an example, my grandfather and my grandma on my dad's side both went to boarding school. And then my grandma and my mom both had attended boarding schools. My mom not that long, but it was when she was younger. So this isn't history to us. This is impacting us today. Termination and relocation. So termination didn't really impact any of the Montana tribes, but relocation did. So there were these policies that were really like, oh, move here and you're going to get a good job. You're going to, be able to get money and be a real like American. And there were some places in Montana that were actually relocation cities. So out of Montana, you hear of places like Seattle and Chicago, like those were major relocation cities, but we had some here in Montana. So Butte and Glasgow were one of them, and even Missoula. So my grandmother, she grew up in East Glacier Park, and she was able to relocate to Missoula to go to like the technical school there. And my mom remembers being little and having to help clean hotel rooms because they didn't have any money. They got there and they didn't have any place to stay. They didn't have any money and they didn't have enough money to go home a lot of different times. So when we're thinking about someone who's pregnant or gonna be going into labor, now they're in these cities where they don't have their support system. They're exposed to discrimination and they just don't have their support networks and aren't able to go home. Here's a flyer from that time period. Some more common, or not more common, but more recent reproductive injustices that happened. The Indian Child Welfare Act. That was a big topic in Montana this past year. But that had to happen because people were, after boarding schools were like found out to be, yeah, yikes, we probably shouldn't, we don't like sending kids there isn't good. The next step, I guess, or a different, more acceptable route was to remove children and put them into foster care. So even today, there are way higher rates of Indigenous children placed in foster care. And the same thing with the boarding schools. You're not able to see how your parent, you're not able to get the benefits of your culture when you're separated from your family and community like that. And we know that now. That's why states like Montana are upholding ICWA and making sure that we do everything we can to keep Indigenous children with Indigenous communities and family members. Also sterilization. There is some reporting on this, but not enough. People weren't really keeping good data about this. But yeah, a lot of American Indian, Alaska Native women were sterilized. I would say against their will, because a lot of times the stories that we hear, people didn't know. People didn't know what was happening. And there were a lot of folks that were being sterilized before they were even 21. There were 15-year-olds getting sterilized by the Indian Health Service. So these impact trust today. So Self-Determination Act, I think just to highlight here, it's just that this really recognizes tribes as sovereign nations, and that it gives the legal basis for certain things like establishing Tribal 638 programs instead of just Indian Health Service, where the budget is already set. As a Tribal 638 program, you're able to administer your own healthcare programs. So it's great, but it's a really hard thing to do. Through all these treaties and policies, the United States does have federal treaty obligations to provide healthcare services to Indigenous people here. This first started happening actually within the War Department back in the 1800s. And then in 1921, the Snyder Act was passed, and that was the kind of more formal way that authorized Congress to fund American Indian healthcare. I should put an asterisk there because like fund American Indian healthcare, they won't really do a great job at allocating funding to the Indian health. It's always been underfunded. It's interesting to think about what the status of health would be if we for once had a fully funded Indian Health Service budget. But the Indian Health Service, there's these, it's called the ITU system. So the I is the Indigenous Health Service, that's on reservations. Like in Fort Belknap, we have an IHS clinic. The T is Tribal 638 programs. So whenever I think Tribal 638, I think of the CSKT tribes, Rocky Boy, they have Tribal 638 programs. And especially Rocky Boy, they're able to do just a lot of really cool things for their people because of the status. And then the urban Indian health centers, there's way more urban Indigenous people, but the budget for them is very, very low, even though there's more. So there's urban Indian health centers, places like All Nations in Missoula that operate as a federally qualified health institute. FQH acronyms. But really, speaking of like how it's so underfunded, for Medicaid, it's about $8,000 per person. But for the IHS, it's like $4,000 per person. And with Medicaid, it expands, like the population grows, so the budget grows. But because of the way the Indian Health Service is set up, it is each year redetermined by Congress how much they're going to allocate. So it's an appropriations policy, and the appropriations committee decides that. All of this being said, when we look at the health inequities that we're facing and the health disparities and the differences in the numbers of these high rates of maternal morbidity and mortality, I like to remind myself of what I had the privilege of hearing Cami Goldheimer talk about when a physician tried to mention that the Native women in his clinic were non-compliant. She said, there's nothing wrong with Native women. We are perfect the way we are. And like all mothers, we want the best for our babies. It's the system that is failing us. And so I hope that this first part of this presentation was able to kind of help everybody see that. I do want to end with just some strength-based cultural constructs, since we focused on the historical constructs. Culture has already been proven to be a protective factor for many issues like mental health. But in order to capitalize on that, we need to recognize them. We need to recognize the strengths within Indigenous communities so that we can identify solutions and interventions. So when I think about this, and I think about my education, and I think about what I was learning, what I was taught in school, and the specialized education I had to get in order to learn more about it, it's like, what other strengths are we missing? What else are we overlooking from Indigenous communities? Here on the other side, there's some Indigenous cultural strengths that the SAMHSA has put out. It's like a culture card is what they call it. But these are just some strengths that they listed out. And I want to pull out just a few specific to this perinatal period. So pregnancy, that this time of life, like being pregnant, birth, like these are very sacred times. They say that birth is ceremony. So when we're thinking about the types of changes that people can make, like it's a sacred time. And because of that, an Indigenous value is supporting that person. So having those social relationships, that extended family and these big kinship networks would create a support system for this person during their birthing experience and during pregnancy. But we don't really, my fear is that we don't see that a lot more because of things like having to take time off of work and having to travel and all of this stuff. But we do, that is still pretty ingrained of like, we do have a strong social support system. And this is something you may have seen if you have someone who's staying in your hospital and they have a packed waiting room. There's also a strength of that intergenerational knowledge and wisdom and that strong connection to past and future. So we oftentimes acknowledge our ancestors, but we also acknowledge the future generation. And then the strength of retaining and reclaiming our traditional language, our practices, and other Indigenous healing modalities, especially related to pregnancy, birth, and parenting. And just to close it out, everybody is different, so just never assume. So now I'm going to leave you with some kind of time to reflect a little bit. What have you been taught about Indigenous peoples? Where did you learn this information from? What opportunities have you even really had to learn? In conclusion, cultural competency is just not enough, and we must approach this work in relationship with Indigenous peoples. And it's going to take a lot of work to create cultural safe care in Montana, but Indigenous birthing people are deserving of this effort, and the benefits of health equity are worth it. So next up, coming on October 24th at noon, I'll talk a little bit more about some of those Indigenous cultural strengths and thinking about different scenarios where we can see Indigenous strengths and how these differences can be viewed as strengths and not barriers. And then we'll learn more about collaborating with Indigenous stakeholders and kind of how to do that. And then we'll go into step 3, which is more of the cultural safety skill building around communication differences. So thank you very much. I left a few minutes for questions. Let me see the chat. I'm almost scared to open up the chat because there's it says 49 chats. That's awesome. You guys are a great interactive group. Love to see it. I'm going to stop sharing and maybe we can turn on our video and chat for a few minutes. Oh yeah, Margaret Ann brought up a good point. The Orange Shirt Day, September 30th.
What is Orange Shirt Day? I don't know what that is.
Oh, that is to recognize all of the children. So a few years ago, a mass unmarked grave up in Canada was discovered near they call them in Canada, residential schools. And so they're finding them more here in the United States. Well, people are finally looking for them. In our families and a lot of Indigenous communities have always known that these things happen, but now we actually have, I guess, Western scientific proof of these unmarked graves. And so the Orange Shirt Day is to recognize those children who never made it home from boarding schools.
Wow, thank you.
Yeah, there's a lot of great information out there about it. I encourage you to look it up. And it's a way to build awareness,
Yeah, I would say for me, I grew up on the East Coast and we never really talked about Native American culture. I feel like we focused a lot more on civil rights and the history of Black people and enslavement more so than Native American. And just hearing from you, it seems like there are some, parallels in how they were treated, but this is all really new for me. So thanks for all the history lesson.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And it's kind of it's a little bit similar today, like when we're talking about what we learn about in history, and we learn some about slavery. Hopefully that will continue in a lot of curriculums. But even when we're looking at maternal health data, when we talk about race inequities, it's often in the literature looking at Black women, and then Indigenous people are kind of othered out of those reports. So it's definitely not a competition. It's not like a oppression Olympics situation, but we are just trying to get that recognition of like there's work to be done here too, and we need to also focus on Indigenous birth equity issues.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, I'm trying to read everybody's comments, but thank you all for listening to an hour.
Can I ask a question, Amy?
Hi.
Yeah. I'm just wondering if you have any tips on engaging people in conversations around how these issues are like impacting the health of moms and children in our state in the worst ways. I find often that when I start to sort of brush up against stuff around cultural safety, I get a lot of hackles and very defensive remarks, and it makes me not want to stop, but I also don't want to shut it down it seems like there's like a lot of fear around talking about some of these things, and I want to acknowledge that and would love some like help or some direction pointing towards resources if you have anything.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have all the answers to that. I feel like for the most part, people I talk to this about are very, they want to be here, they want to learn. So I don't get any like hecklers in the chat. I haven't seen any. Steph, if you see them, get them. Just kidding. No, I'm just joking. But actually, we were just at this really cool conference called City Match, and it's really about social justice and maternal child health. And there was a great keynote speaker that talked about negotiation, because it kind of is a negotiation, right? When we're talking about like health equity, we want people like we want that goal, and we want that goal because health equity means higher level of health for everybody. So there was some really great stuff on there, but he has a LinkedIn podcast, what is it called? Oh my gosh. I will listen to it. I've been listening to it every morning. Sounding all good. Every morning this week. The last 2 mornings this week. Negotiate Anything is the podcast by Kwame Christensen. But and he has a couple podcasts on there about these difficult conversations regarding race and in particular. And I think it is kind of a negotiation strategy. Like me, I kind of want to wash my hands of it and be like, oh, that's emotional labor, I don't want to do it. But if we really want to make a difference, and especially from if we want to practice critical allyship, we do need people to be willing to have these tough conversations with their colleagues. And so I would suggest starting with some of those podcasts. He also has a book, and just educating yourself and knowing more, and always come back to, it's not personal. Like it's not it's not, an attack on somebody. It's just recognizing the educational system that we were brought up with.